Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Ever heard about those hidden figures in history? You know, the ones who change the game but don't always get the spotlight?
Oh, yeah.
That's what we're diving into today. A pivotal moment in American politics you might not know about.
Okay.
But it's had a huge impact on the country ever since. We're talking about Hispanic representation in Congress way back in the 1960s.
It's a fascinating period.
I bet.
The civil rights movement is in full swing, but one group often gets overlooked.
Who's that?
Hispanic-Americans. They were facing immense challenges, systemic discrimination woven into the very fabric of society.
And yet, in the middle of all this, 4 guys managed to break through. Henry B. González, Edward Roybal, Joseph Montoya, and Manuel Luján Jr.
Right?
They all got elected to Congress, which might not sound like a big deal now.
Well,
But back then, it was revolutionary.
absolutely. These weren't just individual wins. Their victories were a sign of something much bigger happening. They were like cracks in a foundation, paving the way for a more diverse and representative democracy.
Yeah, I see that.
But to really grasp the significance,
Yeah.
we need to understand just how stacked the deck was against them.
Okay, so let's set the scene. What was the situation for Hispanic Americans, particularly Mexican Americans, in terms of political power back then?
Well, for a huge chunk of U.S. history, they're practically shut out.
Really?
Yeah. Discriminatory laws, language barriers, economic inequality, you name it, all these things worked to keep Hispanic Americans away from the levers of power.
Wow. So how did they start to gain a foothold? The source material mentions the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as a turning point.
Right. The Voting Rights Act was huge, no question. It outlawed all those sneaky tactics used to stop people from voting based on their race.
Uh-huh.
And then the 1975 amendments took it even further, requiring things like bilingual ballots. That was a game changer, finally giving Hispanic communities a real chance to have their say at the ballot box.
But laws are only as good as the people enforcing them. What about those working on the ground and making sure these changes actually happen?
Oh, absolutely. Groups like LELAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens,
Yeah.
and MPA,
Okay.
the Mexican-American Political Association, were vital. They were the boots on the ground, organizing voter registration drives, pushing for better policies, and actively supporting Hispanic candidates. They were the engine of this movement.
So we've got this backdrop of legal battles, grassroots organizing, and a society grappling with its own inequalities.
Right.
It's into this whirlwind that our first trailblazer steps onto the stage.
Okay.
Henry B. González from Texas.
Henry B. González was a force of nature. He was the very first Hispanic representative from Texas, elected to the House in 1961. And remember, even back then, Texas was a major player in politics.
Yeah.
Winning there was a big deal.
I bet. And it sounds like he wasn't afraid to shake things up. The source material mentions his epic 36-hour filibuster in the Texas Senate. That's almost 2 days.
Yeah.
What was he fighting against?
Segregation bills, no less. This was before he even got to Congress. He was already a fierce advocate for civil rights.
Wow, that really shows his commitment. Once he got to Congress, did he focus on similar issues?
He did. But he also broadened his scope. He became a champion for affordable housing, economic reforms, anything that would uplift those who'd been overlooked and left behind.
It's interesting, the source material emphasizes how González made sure federal programs actually reached those underserved barrios. It wasn't enough for him to just pass laws. He wanted to see real change on the ground.
That's a key theme we see with all these guys, a deep commitment to using their power to improve the lives of their communities. It wasn't just about being in Congress. It was about making a tangible difference.
So now we've got González making waves in Texas.
Right?
What about other parts of the country?
Well, shift your focus to California.
Okay.
That's where Edward Roybal comes in.
Roybal.
He was elected in 1963, became the first Hispanic American from California to reach the House since the 19th century. That's almost a century without representation,
Wow.
which is pretty mind-boggling when you think about it.
It really makes you realize how long and difficult the struggle for representation was. And like González, Roybal also started in local politics.
Exactly. He cut his teeth on the city council before jumping to the national stage. And Roybal's legacy is immense.
It is.
Oh, yeah. He went on to found the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in 1976, a group that's still incredibly powerful today, shaping policy and advocating for Hispanic communities.
So we've got these 2 powerhouses,
Uh-huh.
González in Texas, Roybal in California. Were there others emerging around the same time?
You bet. Now, González and Roybal weren't alone in this fight. Out in Mexico, 2 other figures were making their mark. Joseph Montoya and Manuel Luján Jr.
Okay.
And what's fascinating about them is that they show the growing influence of Hispanic politicians even across party lines. Montoya was a Democrat, while Lujan was a Republican.
That's interesting. You don't always hear about that kind of cross-party collaboration, especially when it comes to issues of representation and social justice.
It's true. And what's even more striking is that Lujan later served as Secretary of the Interior under President George H.W. Bush.
Oh, wow.
It shows how Hispanic politicians were breaking into the highest levels of government.
So we're starting to see a real shift here. It's not just a single victory, but a wave-building momentum. But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Okay.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about how historians have different views on how to interpret this era. Not all of them agree about the level of progress, right?
You see, not all historians agree on how to interpret this era. Some, what we call the progressives.
Okay.
They believe that these guys getting elected was a direct result of decades of activism by everyday people fighting against a system designed to keep them down.
It makes sense. The culmination of years of struggle finally leading to some real breakthroughs.
Exactly. But there are other schools of thought, too. The social history folks, for example.
Yeah.
They put more emphasis on those community organizations we talked about earlier, like ULAC and MAPA. They believe that these groups were absolutely essential in mobilizing Hispanic-Americans and giving them the tools to demand representation.
So from that perspective, it wasn't just about legal changes like the Voting Rights Act,
Right.
but also about the power of communities coming together and organizing themselves.
Absolutely. And then you've got the revisionists. They're a bit more critical. They point out that some early Hispanic political movements focused too much on trying to fit into the existing system instead of pushing for more radical changes.
So they were maybe playing the game a bit too cautiously, not rocking the boat enough to really disrupt the status quo.
That's one way to look at it. And finally, there's the post-colonial school.
Okay.
They see this whole story within the context of U.S. imperialism and immigration policies. Basically, they argue that the inequalities Hispanic Americans were fighting against were rooted in a much longer history of exploitation and discrimination.
It's amazing how looking at the same events through different lenses can reveal so much complexity.
It is.
But I think what really brings this history to life are those firsthand accounts, the personal stories of what these guys went through.
Absolutely. Those personal stories really paint a vivid picture. Like Edward Roybal talking about the overt racism and threats he faced during his campaigns, opponents spreading rumors about him being a communist to try and scare voters.
Wow, playing on Cold War anxieties like that, that's just low.
It is, isn't it? And then you have Henry B. Gonzalez's speeches full of passion and fire, where he directly challenges those discriminatory policies and demands economic justice.
I can practically hear his voice booming through the decades. It seems like these guys were incredibly courageous, not just in their political stances, but in their willingness to stand up and be heard in a system that had actively tried to silence them.
Exactly. Their stories are a powerful reminder that progress rarely comes easy. It takes guts, determination, and a willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The historical context, the systemic challenges, the rise of these four incredible figures.
Right.
But we're just getting started.
That's right. These weren't just individual success stories. They were part of a much larger movement that was beginning to shake the foundations of American politics.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore just how far those ripples spread. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Last time, we were talking about these four trailblazers.
González, Roybal, Montoya, and Lujan.
Yeah. And how they made it to Congress at a time when the odds were stacked against them.
We talked about how their victories weren't just personal achievements, but represented a much bigger shift.
Happening in American politics.
Right.
But you left us with a big question. How did their work in Washington actually translate into real changes for people back home?
Right, because it's one thing to fight for laws and policies in the halls of Congress, but how did that actually impact the everyday lives of Hispanic Americans?
In their communities.
That's what I'm curious about. Did their presence in Congress really make a difference on the ground?
It absolutely did.
Okay.
For starters, just having them there gave legitimacy to the concerns of Hispanic communities.
Yeah.
Before, those communities often felt invisible. ignored by the people in power.
So it was about having a seat at the table,
Right.
but more importantly, making sure those voices were heard and taken seriously.
Exactly. And with these guys in Congress, suddenly those issues couldn't be swept under the rug anymore.
Right.
Their advocacy brought national attention to things like poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to education and healthcare in Hispanic communities.
And did that attention actually lead to real change?
It did. It led to more funding for programs and initiatives specifically designed to address those issues.
Like,
For example, Gonzalez's work on affordable housing helped bring much-needed resources to those underserved barrios in Texas. And Roybal's advocacy for healthcare led to improvements in access to medical care for Hispanic communities in California.
so we're not just talking about theoretical victories here.
No.
These efforts resulted in tangible improvements in people's lives.
Absolutely.
Better housing, better healthcare, better education.
Absolutely. And beyond those material benefits, there was also a huge psychological impact.
I'm intrigued. What do you mean by that?
Well, imagine growing up in a community where you rarely, if ever, see anyone who looks like you in a position of power.
Yeah.
I can see how that would send a message
Yeah.
that you don't belong, that your voice doesn't matter.
All right.
Exactly. But then suddenly you see someone with a similar background, someone who understands your struggles,
Yeah.
representing you on the national stage.
That must have been a game changer for a lot of people.
It was. It instilled a sense of pride, hope, and possibility.
I see that.
It sent a powerful message
Okay.
that you too can achieve great things, that your dreams are valid.
So they were like role models,
Exactly.
inspiring a new generation to believe in their own potential.
Exactly. Their success helped break down those psychological barriers that had kept a lot of Hispanic-Americans from pursuing leadership roles.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in turn, led to a surge in civic engagement and political participation at the local level.
So it was ripple effect.
Yes.
It wasn't just about Washington. It was about empowering communities across the country.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that empowerment had a profound impact on the social and political landscape of the United States.
Okay.
But let's not pretend it was all smooth sailing.
Right. I was just thinking there must have been some pushback against these changes.
Oh, absolutely. There was definitely resistance from those who felt threatened by the growing influence of Hispanic Americans.
Right.
Remember, this was the era of the Civil Rights Movement,
Uh-huh.
a time of massive social upheaval.
Right.
Anytime you have a group demanding equality and challenging the status quo, you're going to encounter resistance.
So how did that resistance play out at the local level?
Well, one tactic was gerrymandering,
Gerrymandering.
where electoral districts were drawn in ways that diluted the voting power of Hispanic communities.
So even though more Hispanic Americans were voting,
Right.
their representation could still be limited through these manipulative tactics.
Exactly. And there were also attempts to intimidate Hispanic voters,
Really?
to discourage them from going to the polls.
It seems like those old tricks of voter suppression never really went away,
Sadly, that's true.
even after the Voting Rights Act.
And we also see resistance in things like discriminatory hiring practices, housing segregation, and unequal access to education.
So even with greater political representation, these systemic issues weren't going to be solved overnight.
Right. It was and continues to be an ongoing struggle.
Yeah.
And progress was often met with fierce opposition. But despite the challenges, the movement kept gaining momentum.
I imagine the victories at the national level,
Yes.
with people like Gonzalez and Roybal in Congress, helped fuel that fight for equality on the ground.
Absolutely. Their presence in Washington gave hope and inspiration to communities fighting for change back home.
So we're seeing this fascinating interplay between national politics and local communities.
Yes, and it's important to remember that these weren't separate spheres.
Right.
They were deeply intertwined.
So the achievements of these four figures had a ripple effect that went far beyond the halls of Congress.
They helped spark a movement that transformed communities across the country,
Yeah.
empowering a generation and paving the way for a more inclusive America.
Now, earlier you mentioned the psychological impact of seeing someone who looks like you in a position of power.
Yes, that feeling of representation and belonging is so important.
But I'm curious, were there any specific examples from the source material that illustrate this impact at the local level?
Absolutely. Roybal, for instance, talked about how young Hispanic Americans would approach him
Yeah.
with tears in their eyes,
Really?
telling him that he'd inspired them to believe that they, too, could achieve their dreams.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is, isn't it? And Gonzalez often spoke about how his election had ignited a sense of hope in his community, a belief that change was possible.
So it wasn't just about policies and legislation.
Right.
It was about changing mindsets and empowering people to believe in themselves.
Exactly. And that shift in mindset had a profound impact on the social and political landscape.
It's like a virtuous cycle. Increased representation led to greater empowerment, which in turn led to even more representation.
Precisely. And that cycle continues to this day.
Right.
As we strive for a more just and equitable society.
So we're seeing how these individual stories connect to a much larger narrative.
Yeah.
A story of struggle, resilience, and ultimately progress.
Yes, and it's a story that's still being written as we continue to work towards a more inclusive America.
Yeah.
But there's another crucial aspect of their legacy that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
One that gets to the heart of what democracy is all about.
Okay. I'm all ears. What is it?
It's the idea of coalition building.
Coalition building.
The power of working across racial and ethnic lines to achieve common goals.
So it wasn't just about advocating for Hispanic communities.
Right.
It was about building bridges and forming alliances with other groups.
Exactly. These figures understood that to achieve lasting change, they needed to work in solidarity with others who were also fighting for social justice.
And that must have been especially important during the Civil Rights Movement, when all these different groups were coming together to demand equality.
Absolutely. So in the next part, let's delve into this idea of coalition building and explore how it shaped their legacy and continues to be relevant today.
All right, so we're back, and you're about to tell us about this idea of coalition building, how these Hispanic-American politicians worked with other groups.
To achieve common goals.
Right.
This is where you really see their political savvy.
Okay.
They understood that lasting change rarely happens in isolation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They knew they had to join forces with others who shared their vision.
For a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And this was especially important during the Civil Rights Movement, when so many different groups were coming together.
To challenge discrimination and demand equality.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how these guys actually engaged in coalition building?
Absolutely. Take Henry B. Gonzalez, for example.
Okay.
He was a staunch supporter of the African-American Civil Rights Movement. He frequently spoke out against segregation and racial injustice.
So he saw the struggle for Hispanic American rights as being directly connected to the fight for Black liberation.
Exactly. He understood that these were shared struggles and that progress for one group would benefit all marginalized communities.
What about Edward Roybal? How did he approach coalition building?
Roybal was really smart about forming alliances with labor unions. He recognized the common ground between working-class Hispanic Americans and other organized labor groups.
So he tapped into the power of economic justice and workers' rights to create a broader coalition.
Right. And those alliances proved to be very effective in pushing for legislation that benefited both Hispanic Americans and the wider labor movement.
All right, so we're seeing how these figures strategically built coalitions.
Across racial, ethnic, and economic lines.
Right.
Yes, and that approach really amplified their impact. It gave them a much larger base of support and allowed them to push for more sweeping reforms.
So it wasn't just about individual wins. It was about building a collective movement for social change.
Precisely. And that legacy of coalition building is still so relevant today as we grapple with things like income inequality, racial injustice, and climate change.
It's a good reminder that we're stronger together.
Absolutely.
That solidarity is essential for achieving real, lasting progress.
Couldn't agree more. The stories of these pioneers are a powerful testament to the transformative power of coalition building.
Now, we've talked a lot about the positive impact of these four politicians, but were there any downsides to their approach? Any unintended consequences?
That's a great question,
Yeah.
and one that historians are still debating.
Okay.
Some argue that the focus on national politics, while crucial for passing certain laws, may have come at the expense of grassroots organizing at the local level.
So there's this tension between working within the system and challenging it from the outside.
Right. And there's also the question of assimilation versus cultural preservation.
Okay.
Some critics say that the emphasis on integrating into mainstream American society might have led to a downplaying of Hispanic culture and language.
That's an important point. It's about finding that balance between becoming part of the larger society while still holding on to your unique cultural identity.
Absolutely.
Right.
These are complex issues,
Right.
issues that continue to be discussed and debated within Hispanic-American communities.
It sounds like there's no easy answer. It's a nuanced and multifaceted story with both triumphs and challenges.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about wrestling with these complicated questions, exploring different viewpoints, and using the past to understand our present.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the historical context to the individual stories to the broader legacy of these remarkable figures.
We've explored their impact on national politics, local communities, and the very fabric of American society.
And we've also touched on some of the ongoing debates and challenges that continue to shape the Hispanic-American experience.
But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The stories of González, Roybal, Montoya, and Lujan. They remind us that change is possible, even when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles.
They were true pioneers who dared to dream of a more just and equitable America.
And their actions help to make that dream a reality.
Absolutely. Their legacy continues to inspire us today as we strive for a society where everyone's voice is heard, where all communities are valued, where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential.
Powerful words. What a journey this has been.
It has. Thanks for taking us on this incredible deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, we encourage you to keep digging into this history. Explore the story of Hispanic-American political activism. Think about how these stories connect to your own experiences and the challenges we face as a society today.
Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding our present and shaping the future.
Exactly. So stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop learning.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.